it seems to me that Hume was someone who was saying that a lot of the metaphysicians before him, or a lot of thinkers before him, they were talking about a kind of necessity and necessary facts. And his essential approach is to show that everything that people have considered to be necessary about the world is something that is actually contingent. And his approach to philosophy, his paradigm, has to do with trying to account for why things are contingent. Things that were traditionally thought to be necessary, why they're contingent. Why they don't have the validity that lots of people thought they did. And how they cannot serve as the bedrock assumptions of our thinking and action. Now, let us move a bit and show exactly how the previous syllogisms differ from the most boring example of a deductive syllogism. But the fact that it is boring is helpful here because it's not about novelty, it's about being right. So, the most, let's say, tiresome but correct example of a deductive syllogism is the following. All human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a valid conclusion and a valid argument. And one of the reasons why it is valid is that no new element is added in the conclusion. Everything in the conclusion is involved in the premises. If it was not, then it would be arbitrary. So if we go back to these syllogisms, we will see that Hume is right. And he does have a point in saying that the premises have no reference to moral obligation.
There are additions being made.
Exactly.
Whereas with the Socrates example you've just given, even if you add extra contingencies on top of them that have more moral elements, like Socrates lived in this particular way, doesn't change the base conclusion that he's still mortal from those two initial premises.
Yes. So the difference between these two syllogisms is that in the syllogism that we talked about before, there is nothing new in the premises. Everything that is in the premises is there also. There's nothing new in the conclusion. Whereas here, out of nowhere, we just have this ought. Out of nowhere, we have this obligation. So this is the problem that Hume is raising, and this is the problem that Kant is trying to solve. Now let's see how here Hume's point in a nutshell. You cannot derive a conclusion about what one is morally obliged to do or not to do from premises that do not involve the notion of a moral obligation, because that is arbitrary. Okay? And you see, where we have the problem with scientism is that if fundamentally you think that everything is down to the matter in motion, and matter in motion has no welfare, and there is no morality in matter in motion, then you'll never be able to derive morality. Because when you ask why, and you try to systematize and understand what is being said and what grounds particular moral precepts, you will not be able to find it.
See, that's perhaps some of my confusion here is that I think that that's a different definition of scientism to the one that I would apply. You're seeming to refer to scientism as the purely emotionally detached understanding of physical matter, whereas what I've always understood as scientism as in my own understanding is a almost pathological religious devotion to the idea of science, completely ignoring your own your own biases, and also subscribing to a particular vision of science that reinforces your own biases. So it's a very emotionally charged version of science, like Reddit science. For instance, these are the sorts of people that would completely deny any scientific basis or theories regarding overall group differences in behavior, intelligence, and such, not necessarily because there is scientific evidence refuting it, but purely because of the fact that it makes them feel bad to consider. That's my understanding of scientism.
I think there is plenty of room to agree and to also make some additions, because you referred to the manner in which a belief is held, which you could say some people are really emotional about their theories, others aren't so emotional. Whereas I'm talking about the content of the belief. So you could have the same belief that is being approached in two different ways. You could have, for instance, a very emotional theist and a very non-emotional theist, or a very emotional atheist and a very non-emotional atheist. Scientism, for me, has to do with the belief that science can account, natural science, because the original concept of science has to do with knowledge. I'm talking about natural science, can account for everything, and that the methodology of all disciplines should be the methodology that the natural sciences are using. And there's the extra implication that unless something can be answered in such a way, it is meaningless. That is why you see right now a lot of people who are in favor of scientism, desperate, trying to completely do away with a lot of the traditional metaphysical thinking and a lot of the traditional philosophical aspect of Western civilization. Let's say.
To be fair, I can think of an example of what you're talking about straight off the top of my head, which is oftentimes people have pointed out that those who are more conservatively minded have a more active amygdala in their brain, and they feel fear more strongly, which is one of the things that perhaps leads them to have more conservative beliefs. It leads them to be more protective. It leads them to be more prefer their in-group, because they prefer what they know and what is comfortable to them than new and novel experiences, partially because of their amygdala being more active. And some leftists and progressives use this to completely dismiss all conservative thought as purely something that's down to a chemical reaction in the brain. Whereas I would say actually that it's perfectly natural to have these instincts, and it's actually very strange to me that other people are basically bragging about the fact that they have no kind of survival instinct. So yeah, I can see how you mean, and also once again, it's based off of their own personal biased interpretation of that information, but they're still using a scientific explanation to dismiss. Because I could evenly respond to them, well, you're only a leftist because your amygdala is less developed than mine is.
Yes, and there are lots of suggestions, let's say, that I think that several people are making when they're saying that let us try to find the biological or the, let's say, the brainy grounding of our beliefs. So personally, I think that this is something that is a dead end when it comes to morality. And it is also, I don't believe it is true, because for me, this is something that becomes inevitable if we embrace the current intellectual orthodoxy, which is Humeanism, and I do not. So there is no room in Humeanism or this kind of approach in let's call it scientism, because I don't know exactly if Hume would be happy with it. I think there is no room for anything other than that. That is why a lot of people who embrace this, they just can't work their way around it. And they're trying to give, for instance, biological underpinnings for everything. But I think you can definitely say that the brain is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for thought. You can say that without a brain we wouldn't think. But to say that the brain thinks is like saying that the engine of a plane flies. You could say, for instance, if we make an analogy, and this is, by the way, by Peter Hacker, a scholar of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said a really interesting thing. There's a mereological fallacy when people talk about the brain. They are confusing the part with the whole, and he would say it's a human being who thinks. We wouldn't think if we had no brain, in the same way that a plane wouldn't fly if it had no engine. But that doesn't mean that it is the engine that flies.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.